villainous he is to kill. If you love stories like this, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you'll never miss the next episode. Sitting on the throne, surrounded by her generals, she smirked and exclaimed, acknowledging what was presented to her as a holy artifact. However, inwardly, she panicked, wondering if she had gotten it wrong. Was it actually a holy artifact? It felt so cringeworthy. The line she had practiced countless times, a line that only appeared a few times throughout the entire novel, just didn't stick. Suddenly, a subordinate burst into the room, shouting her name in a panicked state, informing her that they had arrived at the gates of the Demon King's castle. The minions surrounding her all turned to face the panicked subordinate, arguing among themselves about going out and chopping up the intruders. The princess immediately told them to hold on. Since she had reincarnated into the novel, she had made many mistakes, but this time, she couldn't afford to make another one. She stood up, pointed her hands, and issued her orders. She commanded Zanbar and Talim to go to the first sector of the Demon Lord's castle entrance, while Roxanne and Belzeb were to head to the second sector. They bowed in agreement and departed to follow their various commands. She remained in the throne room alone, seemingly waiting for someone. When the door finally opened, a cloaked figure entered. She turned, wondering if he had arrived yet. He was Keelhurrian Alicia. He removed his cloak, stating that he had found her. They stared at each other without speaking for a moment. Panic washed over her as she realized she had forgotten her lines. She had wanted to say, "How pathetic, you're just a rookie. What a flop." Recomposing herself, she stood up, formed a purple ball in her hand, and declared that she would deal with him personally. He replied that he would rip out her heart. This was the moment she had longed for. It was embarrassingly brief, almost too short to call a part of the novel, but it was the scene where her character dies at the hands of her favorite male protagonist. She guessed it was time to say goodbye. Her thoughts drifted back to when she was first reincarnated. Lying in bed, dressed in pajamas with her phone in hand, she had been a police officer in her past life, with hardly any time to spare. Digitalized afterlife. What the heck? It was only after arriving in the afterlife that she could finally enjoy hobbies while waiting for reincarnation. Staring at her phone and laughing, she noted that they had said it was scary to get into a fandom late, with so many interesting web novels to read. In a chat with fellow fans, one had commented that the author's work was really good, questioning why it wasn't popular. Another replied jokingly, saying that it was probably only popular among the dead. They all laughed. She had hoped the novel wouldn't get canceled and asked when the reincarnation would take place. Someone responded, saying there were a lot of reincarnations in novels lately and wishing they could at least do possessions. They continued by saying there had been a lot of talk about novel possession and its system. Are these people actually texting and reading novels in the afterlife? I can't even laugh anymore, I'm rolling here. Surprised, she exclaimed, "Oh my gosh," and asked if there was really something like a reincarnation system. Possession system? She typed in the chat, reading the replies. They explained that it was like an experience during reincarnation, but since the system hadn't been fully developed yet, only a few people were being selected and tested. Someone joked, asking what she would do if she got reincarnated into a horror movie. She wondered if she was being tested for selection and hoped she would get in. The conversation continued when there was a knock on her door. She turned back, wondering who it was, and stood up to open it. A man greeted her with a smile, calling her by her past life's name, Hungayan Kim, and remarking that it had been a while. GM Sungael, Team 1 Grim Reaper, he introduced himself, explaining that the expected waiting time for reincarnation was almost 800 years now. Among those who had waited a long time, some nearly went crazy. That was why they introduced a new system, which had become quite popular, and he was there to recommend it to her. He explained that while waiting for her reincarnation, she could live as a possessor in a web novel. No way, she freaked out happily, knowing it would be the possession system. Kim eagerly screamed that she wanted to do it. She told him she wanted to possess Yeoju from Winter Waltz, quoting her favorite line from the novel, "Will you bake cookies and give them to me?" He smiled nervously and told her that she could only possess characters from novels she had read recently. She paused briefly and then asked about the female lead from the last book she had just read. He smiled widely, saying it was also difficult to select the character she wanted, and asked if it was right. Kim didn't care at all and immediately told him it was right. She just wanted to do it. He finally told her to make sure she held onto her phone because she could use it in the novel. Everything she was curious about was in it. Ending their conversation, he wished her fun. The story she was supposed to enter was the love story of Crown Prince Keel and Countess Roseanne. In the next second, her phone exuded a bright white light. In that moment, all Kim could think about was how awesome it was. To her, it didn't matter if she became a villain or the female lead. She noted that she was going to be as thin and tall as possible and enjoy every luxury she could. However, if it were possible, she wanted to be the female lead and date Keel. As she entered the novel, she heard voices calling her princess repeatedly. Though still unconscious, she could hear them. Princess? She wondered, thinking it was a beautiful title. She knew that if she had been reincarnated into a fantasy world, she should have a noble and glamorous life. Her eyes finally opened, and she saw who was calling her. They asked if she was all right. She screamed, so loudly that everyone outside could probably hear it. The bear panicked and asked her why she was screaming. Damn, girl. Where did they take you to? Why was she screaming? She wondered, stuttering as she tried to process the fact that a bear was standing beside her. A bear in an apron? Meanwhile, the bear looked genuinely worried about her, wondering if she was hurt. But she couldn't get over the fact that a real bear was right beside her. She touched her face, feeling her features frantically, hoping she hadn't been turned into a story like The Princess Who Became Bear Soup. She felt around her surroundings until her hands landed on the covers in her lap. Looking down at them, she exclaimed, "What?" It was as if her life had flashed before her eyes. She screamed, throwing the cover at the bear and asking what the heck it was. After all her tantrum, she finally got up and went to the mirror to see what she looked like. Seeing her reflection, she breathed a sigh of relief that she was still human. But if she was still human, then... By the way, she touched her face, wondering if there was actually a character with black hair and red eyes in the novel. Then, realization hit her. Bellatrice. She immediately pulled out her phone to search for the name, but no results came up. How is it possible that no results appeared? She thought it was impossible for someone without a name to be living in a place like this. She exclaimed in disbelief, still staring at her phone. The bear stood quietly, confused. She realized she had become the Devil's Daughter, a character who had only appeared once and had just 3 lines. The main character Keel must defeat her, the ultimate villain, the worst of them all, to become the emperor. The line was, "How pathetic. You're just a rookie. I'll deal with you myself." And so, it's a holy artifact. She held her head in tears over the fact that she had just 3 lines. A glamorous and beautiful life as a noble lady? Wasn't that what one usually got when reincarnated? No. Even the daughter of the devil could live well, she thought, setting out to make the demon world look like a fairy tale world. Not gonna happen, Tinkerbell. If her previous life had been fast and hard, this time, she was determined to live slowly and enjoy every second. But she didn't know that the future she wanted wouldn't come. At dinner, the chef, who turned out to be a mantis, served her food. Raw and fresh hearts, livers, bones, and other organs. Gazing at the plate, she asked if she was supposed to eat it. Seeing her expression, the mantis asked if the food wasn't to her taste and assured her that from then on, he would prepare the raw entrails without making them fresh. She slapped her forehead, feeling utterly exhausted by the fact that the chef was a mantis. The bear, noticing her reaction, smiled wickedly, grabbing the mantis by the neck and telling her she would kill him and find a new cook. Ha 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 ha. Is it that easy to dispose of him? Bro. She yelled that a mantis couldn't be a chef. The mantis argued that it was unfair because, in the human world, even rats could cook. Is he actually talking about Ratatouille? Crazy. The bear immediately jumped in, saying she would go find a rat chef then, and telling her to leave it to her. The princess screamed, explaining that it wasn't going to work and that she was just saying the same thing over and over. She stared at them, wondering how their brains even worked. How could they come up with the idea of finding a rat chef? Why is that seriously coming as a shock to her? Like, they're literal talking animals in front of you. A mantis is a chef, and the idea of finding a rat chef came as a shock to you? Come on, girl. She sighed, trying to think positively, stating that she could change them one by one. She made a mental note to take a deep breath, smiling and consoling herself that it was just like training an animal. She told them to go find her a human cook. They stopped and stared at her, making her realize she would have to kidnap a suitable one. As she walked through the hallway, she thought to herself that keeping calm was out of the question. She just needed to use her power to change things. Except for the Demon King, who was in hibernation or succession, she was currently the number one, right? She sat on a tree, folding her arms, and decided that the first thing she needed to do was make the castle more colorful. I wonder what that would be like, a so-called devil in a colorful castle. She noted inwardly that even a gloomy castle could become luxurious if decorated with expensive furniture. Her Highness ordered them to get the items used by nobles, only to receive a unanimous shout from them, declaring that they would steal everything. She stayed quiet for a moment, then smiled, telling them they didn't have to steal anything, they could just buy it. One of them raised his hand and asked what she meant by that. Her Highness explained that they could simply pay for the items with money. They all gasped immediately, realizing for the first time that humans had money. But instead of understanding, they decided to steal the money and kill the humans as well. Her Highness shouted that there was no need to kill humans. They then asked if they could just gouge out their eyes instead. She refuted that idea as well, saying they couldn't do that either. They murmured among themselves, confused that they couldn't kill the humans or gouge out their eyes. Her Highness held her face, bending down for a moment, reasoning to herself that this possession was a failure. She noted that if the original story ended as planned, the employee of the Grim Reaper had told her she would keep living there until she died, or a staff member would come by to check if she wanted to be possessed by another novel. Kim had asked the worker what would happen if things didn't turn out the way they did in the original novel. He reassured her not to worry, as the force that drives the story to follow the original plot was much stronger than she thought. Okay, she exclaimed, deciding that since it had come to this, according to the original story, she would become the greatest villain and have a glorious death. But then she thought for a moment. It was 1163 now, the year when the male lead, Keel, and the female lead, Roseanne, met for the first time. Keel, the emperor's illegitimate son, entered the palace at the age of 15. Unable to wield the magic that any member of the royal family could use, he would later find holy relics and reclaim his royal magic at the age of 18, meet Roseanne, and her Highness would die. In 1167, when Keel was 21 years old, for years from now, she wondered if she could endure it all alone. The demons amongst themselves questioned why she was acting as she was, realizing that maybe she was just in a bad mood. Well, they are devils indeed, so I understand why doing good would make them think she was in a bad mood. But still, it's just so funny, looking at it from an outsider's point of view. One of them spoke up, asking the princess if she wasn't feeling well and whether she would consider receiving a gift from him. Her Highness was shocked by what he had said and immediately told him that he didn't need to give her anything, nothing at all, as she knew he would just give her something weird again. She was already going crazy thinking about it. For years, she just had to manage and survive somehow. She knew that even if she gave up and put up with everything else, she couldn't endure the grotesqueness. The demons discussed amongst themselves whether she was actually tired of receiving fingers. Another asked whether they should give her something more brutal, suggesting that evisceration sounded good. Hearing all their thoughts, she hurriedly told them to hold on. Ooh boy, I just can't stop laughing. Seeing what they're arguing about really cracks me the heck up. She thought to herself that according to the settings there, she was the daughter of a very strong devil. She then asked them what if they moved forward in time by 4 years and faithfully fulfilled the original role. Bellerai smirked, standing up and revealing her wings. She began to form a field with her magic, laughing and declaring that she was heading to the next novel, calling them foolish beasts. They widened their mouths, calling out her name in shock, only for their expressions to change to one of warmth. Her Highness held her head, laughing warily, wondering why it wasn't working. She didn't feel like she had used all her magic power, yet they looked even more shrunk than before. She pondered if using too much magic could make one's body shrink. Finally, she asked if anyone knew what year it was in the human world. They stayed quiet for a bit. She asked again, "Anyone?" Someone finally raised his hand, saying it was the year 1153 in the imperial calendar. Hearing his answer, she couldn't believe it. She asked what year it was right now, and he repeated, 1153. She asked him to say it again, which he did. Not wanting to believe the first person, she yelled and pointed at another in the crowd, telling him to tell her what year it was right now. "Me?" the creature exclaimed in fear. He shivered, telling her that it was the year 1153. She screamed in panic, realizing that 1153 wasn't 4 years later. It was 10 years ago. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Keel and his subordinates were under attack, but they were all inside a protection shield, facing each direction and preparing for battle. Keel gritted his teeth, assessing the situation. One of his subordinates called out, suggesting they should start the treatment, but Keel refused, saying he was okay and that they should just keep going. One of his men asked His Majesty Keel if they really needed to risk so much just for a holy relic. His Majesty knew it was a lot to risk, but he couldn't help it. Since the founding of the country, he was the only one who couldn't use magical powers. The cursed prince and the emperor's illegitimate son. Despite countless efforts over time, the title hadn't disappeared. Instead, it had grown. He noted inwardly that if he could just collect the holy relic and receive heaven's protection to regain his magic powers. Suddenly, a bright light grabbed his attention, and he shielded his eyes from it, exclaiming, "Ugh." He wondered what the light was, as he couldn't see anything. He panicked, questioning where his sword had gone. What he felt now was a chain. Looking at himself, it seemed as if he had gone back in time. He was smaller, with chains on his neck. It had been 10 years since the Demon King had given her to the princess and went into hibernation. Everyone was looking forward to seeing what type of experiences and things they would achieve with the princess around. After summoning the demons for the first time, she slumped helplessly in the chair, lamenting that everything was ruined. She questioned why, of all people, she had to possess someone like that. Knowing she wouldn't even appear much in the novel, she wondered how much better it would have been if she had just possessed a human. Wait a minute. A human, she exclaimed as if struck by a sudden idea. She knew that when one becomes an adult and inherits the Demon King's power, there were only 2 ways to escape the demon world: if someone summoned her or if she made a contract with a human. But before becoming an adult, she realized that if it didn't affect the flow of the novel, she could stay wherever she liked. She knew that her character, Villainous, would appear when she was 24 years old and Keel was 22. In other words, she had to hide from the human world for 10 years before becoming an adult. She smiled, knowing she only needed to endure for 4 years. Villainous stood up, and the demon spoke happily, saying she had woken up. "Hey guys," she uttered with a smirk, announcing that she wanted to go to the human world. They glared at her, speechless and shocked, asking why she would want to go to the human realm. It was unexpected. They questioned why she would want to go to a realm of such an inferior race. She insulted them, acting mischievous, saying that if she got to know humans better, she would be even better at torturing them. They shouted in excitement, exclaiming, "As expected of our princess." Such deep meaning. One of them, standing beside her, called out, and she turned to face the creature, asking what the matter was. He told her that when demons cross over to the human realm, they can barely use their powers and suggested she take one of the generals along to assist her. Stupid. She was trying to run away from you guys, yet here you are trying to make her bring one of you along. The cockroach-like creature fiercely suggested that he would go with her. She screamed, clutching her throne. The cockroach was confused by her reaction, asking if he wasn't good enough. Villainous reasoned that anyone in their right mind would scream when a cockroach was talking to them. She turned her face away, telling the cockroach that he couldn't accompany her because she would be in the human world for a long time, so she needed someone with a human appearance. The cockroach argued, proudly stating that since he was a general, he could also transform into a human body. He transformed, just for her to see, but his antennae were still visible. Oh my gosh, this novel is just too much for me to handle. The characters are so crazy. She still disagreed, saying that he was still a cockroach, and she disliked them. Another general spoke up, offering to go instead. This creature transformed from a centipede into what he thought a human looked like, but his centipede claws were still protruding through his neck. He happily declared that he could skin as many humans as she wanted. Bella refuted, saying there was no need. Another general then spoke, claiming that he did things inappropriate for all ages. Bella questioned him, asking what creature he was. This particular creature was a wolf, and when he changed into human form, his third eye still showed on his face. Finally, she pointed to the one called Leopard, saying he would come with her. He immediately transformed into his human form. She noted that he looked the most normal out of all of them. He was General Zanbar. He bowed happily, promising to catch young and fresh humans for the princess every day. She quickly refuted, saying there was no need. Although it seemed somewhat manageable, she wondered if it would actually be fine. She uttered, "Good," inwardly, knowing that it was time for her to head to the human realm. In her room, she lay down facing up, reflecting on how she never thought it would be so difficult for a demon to go to the human realm. She knew that low-level monsters could easily leave the demon realm, but high-level demons like her and Zanbar could only leave through summoning. It had already been a week since she announced her intention to go to the human realm, yet there was no news of a summoning, let alone humans. She sighed in frustration. Suddenly, the bear called out to her, continuously yelling that a summoning circle had appeared. She eagerly looked up, exclaiming, "Really?" She immediately rushed out into the hallway, insulting and cursing everyone who blocked her way. She gazed at the summoning circle, gasping as she observed how it looked. Smirking, she turned to Zanbar, telling him they should leave. He bowed his head in acknowledgement and followed her. As she was leaving, she continued smirking, bidding them goodbye inwardly and promising to see them in 10 years' time. In the human world, where Keel was kept in a cage, they informed him that he was next. He held an amulet, staring at it, realizing that he was truly back. After wandering like a nightmare, it turned out that he was the Emperor's illegitimate son, which was why he had been locked up. His life was terribly miserable. A few meters from his cage, a loud explosion erupted. He looked up immediately, wondering what was happening. The man in the other cage laughed maniacally, asking if his actions had succeeded, as he couldn't believe it. Bellarice finally revealed herself, coughing. Keel's eyes widened in surprise upon seeing her. Bella looked around, wondering where they were. Her eyes caught a glimpse of a mad-looking man. He spoke to her, claiming that he was the one who had summoned her. She looked past him, spotting little children in cages. She immediately ordered Zanbar to kill him, and without wasting any time, Zanbar did it. She walked to the cages and freed the children, gesturing for them to go home immediately. Zanbar bent down and asked her if she was really going to let them go. She pondered how to respond. He scratched his head, remarking that it was a waste of a good meal, expressing his disappointment. Bella lost her temper, scolding and insulting him, while questioning how many times she had to tell him not to touch the children and the elderly. She told him they must have a conscience as people. Zanbar argued, saying that they weren't people. Well, he wasn't actually lying. She scolded him further, questioning how they dared to talk back when she spoke. Keel stood a few meters behind them, watching their interaction. All he could do was exclaim inwardly, "What?" He was utterly confused. He knew that the scene he was witnessing wasn't the same as the past he remembered. Although he didn't remember much, he vividly recalled that wizard stabbing a knife into his chest. At that time, he thought he was going to die, but his mother's keepsake pendant was imbued with divine powers. He had survived countless life-threatening situations thanks to his mother's pendant. Without the divine powers, he wondered how long he would have lasted. He thought that if he could just avoid dangerous places, he folded his arms, bending his head in frustration. asking himself if that was the kind of life he was destined to live forever. It was a shabby existence. Suddenly, Bella smiled at him, asking if he was okay and telling him that he could go home now since there were no more bad wizards. He stayed quiet, thinking to himself that he had nowhere to go. As if she read his mind, she spoke again, offering him the chance to go with her if he had nowhere else to go. Keel's eyes widened as Bella stretched her hand out to him. Keel noted that it was the first time someone had offered to help him with such kind words. He looked up at her in awe, calling her a black angel. This was his first meeting with Bella. He took her hand, and they walked through the woods together. She noticed that his expression was saddened. Despite that, she also observed that Keel really had guts. He wasn't even flustered by the sight of Zanbar in his true form as they argued about whether Zanbar would eat him or not. Zanbar just wants to eat. It baffled her that Keel didn't show a single expression, especially in such a situation. "Hey," she called, grabbing his attention. She asked him if he wanted to be her servant. Keel's eyes widened, but he stayed quiet, not answering immediately. Bella knew that they needed to start off on the right foot. She thought that if she got along with Keel, whom she had just met, she would probably do well in the human world. Since it seemed he had nowhere else to go, she decided to take him along with her. Keel's thoughts raced as he considered that it would be safer to walk with them, even without divine powers. He calmed his mind, reasoning that at least there was an adult guardian with them. Zanbar turned to Bella, suggesting that they should eat first, and that Keel is probably hungry too. Bella told him to just go back. Keel questioned whether it would actually be right to go back, since they called her princess. He reflected that it was as if the past had never happened. He thought that if this was his chance at a new life, he would rather do this than repeat the hellish one. Deciding that he just needed to stay with them for now until he was old enough to be on his own, he bet no one would believe him if he told them he was 18 years old. He looked at Bella, seeing her smiling and staring at something. She announced that they had arrived. He knew that if he made the slightest mistake, he would be dismissed as a mentally unstable child. So, for now, he had to keep his mouth shut and stay in their good graces. They entered the restaurant and reserved the best dishes available. Bella smiled happily, noting that they were the type of dishes she had seen in web novels. Meanwhile, Zanbar stared at the food with visible disgust and confusion, stating that he didn't understand why humans made such a fuss about food. Bella glared at him, telling him to be quiet before he ruined her mood. She sliced a piece of meat, put it in her mouth, and chewed happily. She let out tears of joy, saying that it was delicious. She asked Zanbar if he had tried it, telling him that the way to eat it was to dip it in the soup. Zanbar picked up a huge chunk of meat, pointed at another dish on the table, and asked if that was where he was supposed to dip it. Finally, placing it in his mouth, he held it in extreme shock, exclaiming at the flavor. "Like this?" he asked. Bella noticed that Zanbar seemed to be enjoying the meat. Well, obviously, he looks like a wolf-type creature. She finally turned to look at Keel, noticing that he wasn't eating at all. She wondered if it was because he had never eaten meat before. She asked him if he was okay and why he wasn't eating, saying that even Zanbar was eating, so he should have some. He stayed quiet, thinking to himself that he would only learn how to use a fork later, nervously wondering how exactly an 8-year-old eats. It was as if Bella finally realized the problem and asked him if he didn't know how to use a fork. She looked up at him, wondering if every 8-year-old knew how to use a fork. She immediately grabbed his hand and tutored him on how to use the fork, speaking to him in a childish manner. He held the fork as she taught him and finally took the first bite. Bella patted his head, happy, complimenting him on how good he was, saying he was a good servant. Keel looked up at her, surprised by the gesture she showed him. Zanbar spoke up, questioning her about the point of having a servant who couldn't even use a fork. He glared, saying that one servant was enough, so why that kid? Bella tried to speak codedly, telling Zanbar that Keel looked like an orphan, so probably no one was there to teach him. She said he would learn as he grew. Zanbar argued that they knew right from the day they were born. Bella screamed at him not to talk back to her. Finally, getting the chance to lay down, she slumped on the bed, letting out a sigh, and saying that she felt stuffed. She remarked that if she had spent one more day in the demon world, she would have actually gone insane. She said that even if her life wasn't like those of the noble ladies, she would manage fine with the one she had right now. She recalled that once she became an adult, she would have to stay in the demon world with all those creatures for 4 years. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, bringing her attention back. The person shouted that he was coming in, and she simply replied, "Okay." Zanbar entered with Keel, and from the look on his face, something was wrong. He seemed nervous. Bella smiled at him, remarking that after cleaning up nicely, he looked cute. "What that's?" she exclaimed, asking Zanbar if he was sure he cleaned Keel up properly. She questioned why Keel still stank and whether Zanbar actually used soap. Zanbar responded that he doesn't use anything other than red liquid to wash himself, finally asking in confusion what the heck soap was. I wonder what Bella actually expected. How would a demon know what soap is? I'm sure she keeps forgetting where she is and who she's talking to. Bella's face turned grim. "A red liquid bath?" she asked, realizing that Zanbar must have been using the red liquid to bathe all this time. She exclaimed, "Hey." Still with the same grim expression, she told Zanbar that if he didn't want to listen to her, he should just go back. She insisted that since he was here, he should at least live how humans live. "But I am not," Zanbar retorted. Her face became even grimmer as she announced that in that case, he should just leave. Zanbar finally gave in and said he would take a soap bath. Bella just stared at him, and Keel remained speechless. When Zanbar left the room, Bella turned to Keel, gently dragging his cheeks and cutely telling him that there was no need to be so stiff just because she was with him. He touched his face, a little flustered. Bella asked him how old he was, guessing if he was 5 years old. There was no reply. She went higher, asking if he was 6 years old. He remained silent, but then answered with hand gestures, showing her that he was 8 years old. You're 8, she exclaimed. She looked at him closely, remarking that he was too small to be 8 years old. She didn't think he could speak well since he couldn't even eat properly. She noted that it must have been hard for him to be alone, saying that from then on, they would only eat delicious foods. She sat him on the bed, asking if he had a name. But still, he didn't speak. Instead, he took her hands and started forming letters with her fingers. She paid close attention and finally understood. But her face held a shocked expression as she asked if his name was actually Keel. Confused, Bella stood up, pacing around. She thought deeply to herself that in 1163, Keel was 18 years old, and now it was 1153. She wondered why she was calculating, noting that he was only 8 years old. She turned back, looking at him and observing, wondering if there could be another kid with the same name, the same platinum hair, and also a male protagonist with the same amber eyes too. She was totally confused, asking herself what the chances were of him being 8 years old. It couldn't be. She needed to be sure. She gripped her phone, trying to ask something that only the male protagonist would know. She sat back on the bed and gestured for him to come sit beside her. He moved nervously, and as soon as he sat, she asked him if anyone had ever sent him to a wizard. Keel looked at her, pondering why she would ask him that and asking what she was holding. Keel knew that if he lied for no reason, Bella might end up hating him. Meanwhile, Bella was panicking on her own, eagerly searching for another question to ask him. She finally asked if his mother had left him an heirloom before she passed away. Instinctively, Keel grabbed the item around his neck. Bella noticed this and asked if that was the heirloom. Shocked, Keel asked how she could possibly know that. Bella already had her answer. She could tell by his flustered expression that he was indeed Keel. After the barrage of questions, Keel finally fell asleep in Bella's lap, while she softly patted his hair. She wondered what she should do now that she had picked up the male protagonist like a stray cat. Frustration filled her as she stared at him in deep sleep. She recalled that before Keel became the crown prince, he had survived thanks to the divine powers in the pendant. Bella paused for a moment, realizing with a sense of dread that she didn't possess any divine powers, and yet, he was destined to become the crown prince. She reflected on how Keel had nearly died from the wizard's experiments before meeting an angel. Since then, mysterious powers had always helped him, even in dangerous situations. Finally, she realized that the man they had killed was actually the wizard. She wept quietly, noting that within just 3 days of being possessed, they had already destroyed the entire original story. She wondered what she was supposed to do now, questioning if she should abandon him like a real villainess would. Something important came to her mind. There was a customer service option. She grabbed her phone and started trying to contact the customer service team. She attempted a 1:1 inquiry, but it immediately informed her that the 1:1 function would turn off her phone after she received a response, so it should only be used for emergencies. What the? Ugh, she exclaimed, hoping that people like her had probably asked the same questions before. She decided to check the frequently asked questions, FAQs section. The first question asked if the story could still follow the original plot if the settings were changed. The response explained that the author would revise the settings while editing, and sometimes there were errors in the settings during writing. It said it was okay if the settings changed, as long as they didn't cause major issues. Well, I don't see what can be more major than the issue she currently has on her hands. She knew she had already altered an important setting for the male lead, and she asked herself again to confirm if there was a reset option. She went back to the questions and saw one that asked what to do if someone messed with an important setting and couldn't restore it to its original state. She clicked on the question only to see that the reply stated the only option was to go back 10 years. She wept silently, knowing she was in deep trouble. She realized that she hadn't traveled back in time by magic, but rather the possession system had turned back time. She regretted not checking the instructions carefully before she got possessed. She exclaimed, seeing another question that asked what to do to get the story back to its original plot. Morning finally arrived as the birds chirped, and Bella had stayed awake all night. When Keel woke up, he looked up at her in shock as she greeted him with a good morning. She also wondered if it was really going to be a good morning. They stared at each other for a moment, not uttering a word. It turned out that Keel was the crown prince. It wasn't an adventure story, but a romance fantasy. According to the original works, the story only ends when the protagonist has a happy ending. Bella smiled at him, deciding that she would take care of him until that point was reached. Exactly when she had to send him to the palace to meet Roseanne. It would be good enough. Zanzibar finally joined them, and Bella introduced herself, saying that she was the princess of the animal kingdom. Well, if you look at it, you could actually call it an animal kingdom, so she wasn't far off. Pointing at Zanzibar, she also introduced him as a leopard, saying that Keel saw what he looked like yesterday. Zanzibar was confused, exclaiming, "Huh?" He argued whether he was actually a leopard, revealing his form. Bella immediately turned back and gave him an icy glare, repeating her introduction. "He is Zanzibar, the leopard." He mellowed down and changed the situation completely by transforming into a cute cat, meowing at Keel. Keel's eyes widened in awe. A cat. He was shocked. As Zanzibar changed back to his human form, he faced Bella, telling her that cats were beneath him. But Bella didn't pay him any attention as she continued, asking if Keel had seen that they were actually from the animal kingdom. She told him she would take back what she said yesterday about him being a servant and began to tell him what he would be from now on. Before she could finish, Keel had already started panicking, saying that he couldn't go back to his previous life before he met her. Bella was shocked by his reaction and asked why he was crying. He spoke through his tears, saying that it was fine and that she could eat him, claiming that he had grown to be quite delicious. Her eyes widened in realization of what she had just heard. She asked for confirmation, realizing that he didn't know how to speak properly. Deciding to scare him for lying to her, she bent down and playfully said, "Yum yum, how should I eat you?" She asked him if he would say, "Ouch" for her. He remained silent. Bella finally broke the scare, stating that she was just kidding because cats couldn't eat people. Zanzibar cut in, asking hopefully if he could eat. Before he could finish, Bella kicked him away. Turning back to Keel, Bella noticed he was grabbing onto the hem of her dress, stuttering and pleading that she could always eat him later, but that she should take him with her. Bella was confused. To her, it was just a prompt or two from the settings, but for Keel, it was his reality. Bella lifted her hand and wiped his tears, telling him with a smile that she would take him with her and she wouldn't eat him. He told her he would serve her well then. She told him that he didn't have to be her servant. She knew inwardly that he would become the crown prince one day, so he couldn't possibly be her servant. Instead, she asked him how about becoming a prince, and that she could make him one. He refused, arguing that she needed a servant, not a prince. Bella looked at him, thinking that she had assumed he couldn't speak because he was so quiet, but it turned out that he was actually very eloquent. She asked him why he hadn't spoken until now. He paused for a moment, covering his mouth with his hands, and told her that if she didn't want him to speak anymore, he wouldn't. He added that he would do almost anything she wanted, so please, he pleaded. She wondered how badly he must have been treated to talk the way he did now. Bella pulled him into a hug, which left him utterly shocked. She knew that not everyone needed a tragic backstory, but since this was a romance novel, she decided they would get there happily ever after this time. Zanbar, who was a few meters away, saw their interaction and asked Bella if she was crying, stating that he was sure she was crying at the thought of eating Keel. Bella immediately kicked him out again, making him shout in pain. Moments later, Bella walked down the stairs deep in thought, knowing that she would have at least 10 more years in the human world. The first thing she needed to do was to buy a house, obviously. She approached a man and asked if there were any real estate agencies nearby. She had brought all the gold she could from the demon world, although she wasn't familiar with the market rates. The man scratched his head, exclaiming, "Real estate agencies, huh?" She asked if there was a problem. The man explained that there weren't any real estate agencies in particular, but he mentioned that the late Viscount had left him with something. She smiled happily and was about to ask if they could proceed, but she was interrupted by a red-haired man sitting beside her. He called her a little girl and asked if she was seriously thinking of living there, warning her that a magical tower was nearby, so a lot of magical beasts tended to appear around the area. Well, no offense taken by the little girl. We can all see that he is trying to help. He told her that most of the people who lived around there were travelers, but Bella completely ignored him, hoping he would mind his own business. She turned back to the man and asked him to show her around the property. The man slid a picture to her, showing her the property and explaining that it was currently the only one available, a villa that had belonged to the late Count. She observed it, noting that it was a 2-story mansion with a large garden, a basement, 2 bathrooms, and 8 rooms. She saw that it even had an attic that could be used. The man told her it would cost 30 pieces of gold in total. The red-haired man shouted, "Huh?" questioning what he meant by 30 pieces of gold. He asked the seller if it wasn't a bit outrageous, wondering why it was so cheap. He said that for a mansion like that, the price should be around 100 pieces of gold. Bella listened carefully and understood that according to him, it was cheap. At first glance, you might tell him to mind his business, but if you look and think deeply, you would see that it was actually the right question he asked. But whatever the reason was, Bella was the devil's daughter. She is what people would be afraid of, not the other way around. But oh well, he didn't know that though. She noted that there was no need to buy a bigger house. She picked up the blueprint, staring at it. The red-haired man asked the seller to confirm that there was obviously something wrong with the house. In Bella's mind, she thought that finding an affordable place quickly was just as important, right? While the main focus is romance, there were just as many adventures and murder plots too. He said it was clear the house had problems, and it was clear this young lady, referring to Bella, knew very little about how the world worked. Meanwhile, as the red-haired man worried, Bella had already started planning the space of the house, saying that the garden would be good for Keel to do his basic training. She finally decided to go see it first. The seller yelled at the red-haired man to stay out of it if he wasn't buying it. The man widened his eyes in disbelief, questioning if Bella was actually serious. They went to the mansion to see the area. Seeing how gloomy and creepy it was, Bella looked at the seller and asked how long it had been vacant. The seller looked away, as if he had been caught red-handed, and told her it had been vacant for quite some time. Bella sighed and mentioned that she could tend to the garden later. She then asked the seller to show her the inside of the mansion. "This way, please," he said. As they entered, both of their eyes widened in surprise. The interior was much larger than Bella had anticipated. Compared to the demon world, she found it quite decent. She decided that if there weren't any major issues with the house, She would like to stay there. However, she couldn't shake off what the red-haired man had said about her not knowing how life works. As much as she hated to admit it, his words bothered her. She glanced back at the cellar and, out of curiosity, asked if there was anything wrong with the house. Ooh, little Bella, as naive as ever. Do you really think he was going to tell you the truth if something is wrong with the house? It's quite obvious that something is, but I'm certain it wasn't a